the idea of Israeli self-defense involves sort of like picking some arbitrary starting point when Palestinians fought back and then being like, yeah, that's the first blood in this conflict. That's what.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada Podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa Winstanley.
I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman, and this is the Electronic Intifada Podcast. Joining us to talk about media suppression and coverage in the mainstream corporate media is Greg Shupak. He's a contributor to the Electronic Intifada and just wrote a piece in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting called Israel-Palestine Coverage Presents False Equivalency Between Occupied and Occupier. Greg, it's so good to have you with us on the Electronic Intifada Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. As I said to you when you emailed me, I was going to get in touch to beg to come on, so I appreciate that you saved me the humiliation.
You're totally welcome anytime. So, Greg, give us a sense of, we've been through this so many times, so many decades. 73 years of spin on Israel's settler colonial program in Palestine. Lay out kind of the foundation of what you wrote the other day and what you're seeing in terms of coverage in mainstream corporate media versus reality on the ground.
Sure. Well, there's a variety of different approaches that we see in the coverage. You do see people that are engaging in out and out bloodlust, like Bret Stephens, the New York Times, and people writing at Wall Street Journal who are just, full on calling for whatever they see as total Israeli victory. And we can kind of imagine what that looks like. Those certainly exist and are not rare. I think more common approach this time around in mainstream news media in the US and from what I can tell, Britain and also Canada is the the both sides approach, or the Israel has a right to defend itself approach.
Right. And
the two can kind of blend together. So as I'll take those in reverse order, but as I've mentioned before, as I wrote, I should say, for in my book and in an extract on Electronic Intifada, the idea of Israeli self-defense involves sort of like picking some arbitrary starting point when Palestinians fought back and then being like, yeah, that's the first blood in this conflict. That's what,
We're so surprised they resisted being thrown off their homes and their land.
Yeah, it's
right.
Weird. It's weird how, only Palestinians are the only people in history who kind of object to being murdered and dispossessed and, suffering gruesome, debilitating injuries and humiliation at every corner. So yeah, they do this weird thing where they eventually get fed up with that. And then when they get fed up with that, that's when the violence, quote unquote, starts. And, we have, of course, that being arbitrary and totally dubious, but it also relies on like erasing all these permanent forms of Israeli violence. So in the case of fighting coming from, or resistance coming from Gaza, we can just look at a simple fact like the siege, right? The siege is an act of warfare. It's enforced militarily by the Israeli Navy, Air Force, and by the snipers along the fence. So this is an act of war when there's a siege in place. When you're besieging a population, you cannot claim when that population fights back at some point to be the victim, right? To be merely responding to what they do. They're responding to the siege, among other factors. And that, of course, is without even getting into the bigger picture, longer term history, which the two of you know, and I assume many of your readers do, and we can talk about that if you want. But the fact that what I'm driving at there is just that we have this completely untenable Israeli right to defense, so-called, that gets invoked over and over again, which is based on picking this entirely selective set of facts and excluding others. The corollary, of course, is that there's never any consideration of the Palestinian right to defense or right to resist or right to liberate themselves. So I recently wrote in Jacobin about this, where I looked at the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, and Wall Street Journal for this entire century. There's I think 400 some references to the alleged Israeli right to defend itself, and two references, it's basically the same article published twice, to a Palestinian that mentioned a Palestinian right to defend themselves. And that was a quote from a guy who was basically kicked out of the US military because he said Palestinians have a right to defend themselves and other similar things. So that is that concept is non-existent in mainstream media, and thus is not going to penetrate a lot of the popular consciousness. I mentioned also the both sides narrative. So this similarly rests on obscuring all kinds of power asymmetries that exist. So it's in the title of my FAIR article gets to it, the idea that both sides are at fault, or both sides are suffering to comparable degrees, or that both sides have made comparable mistakes, or whatever these talking points are. You see them over and over again. This only could make sense if it were, I don't know, say a civil war between two equal powers, or two states maybe with roughly comparable degrees of military strength and economic and political power. Not colonizer and colonized, or occupier and occupied. The fact is that when you're talking in terms of both sides, suffering, for example, well, you're obviously drawing this completely false equivalency between the damage being done right now and in the longer history. But there's also a qualitative difference where colonial and imperial violence is treated as no different from anti-colonial counter-violence, as though the effort of a people to liberate themselves were the kind of moral and legal equivalent of the effort to snuff out those liberation movements. Right. So this is really predominant. We can talk at examples, but this both sidesism is probably the most, or at least co-most, with the Israeli right to defense as far as frames for the coverage. And the other main thing I would point out about the coverage is that there's just so much that's left out, and that can be something like the intensified closures. So I talk about this a little bit in the article, and so the closure of Kerem Shalom, the closure of that crossing intensifies the blockade, right? And this is part of the war that Israel's currently carrying out. So this, keeps out things like aid, for example. Like, it even further reduces humanitarian aid, which the siege already does. It jeopardizes the food supply. More accurately, it jeopardizes the electricity supply, which has residual effects across the economy. So that, the economy and the social safety net. So that undermines things like the hospitals. And what I was going to say about food was that the intensified closures of sea access, the tightening of already draconian restrictions for Gaza fishers that have been implemented. This, like the 𝐓𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 closing, has been more or less completely absent from the coverage. There's no indication of the fact in this coverage that 68.5% of Palestinians by the World Food Program's calculation who live in Gaza are food insecure. And I think one article that mentioned in major US media that I looked at, the one that mentioned the increased restrictions on fishers from Gaza, didn't mention that this will further harm the food supply.
Right.
So you have a total absence of the fact that the population living there is already food insecure, combined with a total erasure of the fact that Israel is taking actions that are, virtually certain to worsen that food insecurity, because that fish is now removed from the equation. There's virtually no references to the fact that Gaza is basically a giant refugee camp, and that is significant because that kind of shapes people's whole understanding of what's happening, right? If people just come to have the information that tells them, oh, actually this is Israel bombing a territory full of people that are refugees, and the reason they're refugees is because Israel made them refugees and refuses to let them to go home and thus not be refugees anymore, then that kind of whole series of categories of information really alters the way that the whole dynamic across Palestine looks to people who have that information. But when there's no effort to let audiences understand that these are refugees primarily in Gaza, then that is the kind of thing that enables it to be framed as a matter of both sides, or self-defense for that matter. How Israel can't be defending itself against people that it made into refugees and forces to continue being refugees.
And it's not. I want to talk a little bit about like the top-down, structure for these corporate media, kind of like dictates. So a few days ago, an internal memo was leaked. It was a CNN, some sort of like high up in the CNN officialdom had instructed the news, bureau and all of the writers and whatever to always put Hamas run before talking about the Ministry of Health in Gaza, for example, or any sort of governmental ministry, the police force, the traffic cops, the government clinics, the banks, that they all had to be prefaced with Hamas run. And someone on Twitter yesterday was pointing out, like, why don't we talk about as like Likud run social security, or like the Likud run hospitals. Israel is always framed as this like neutral, benign, sort of like the normal sort of society, whereas the demonization of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims and people all over the Middle East, of course, decades have gone into this, but designating, really kind of explicitly and specifically designating anything run by the Gaza government as Hamas run. What does that do to the reader, and how can you explain this, this dictate from the higher ups at CNN to do that?
Yeah, that's a really just telling and stunning revelation. Yeah, I mean, it's something that is consequential because of the intense propaganda against Hamas really since they've existed, certainly since the second Intifada and their election in 2006. So Yeah, I mean, that's I think what's going on there is it's an effort to legitimize Israeli violence against civilian targets, against the institutions of Palestinian social reproduction. Because yeah, Israel bombed a hospital sounds bad, but Israel, bombed a Hamas-run hospital makes it sound as though this is has some sort of like military element to it. It must be, involved in nefarious, violent activities because it's attached to Hamas, which is understood already from a long-term, concerted propaganda effort to be that and only that. So, I think it's really about legitimizing Israeli violence and also delegitimizing Palestinians' right to exist, right, and to take care of each other and to provide support for their ill and injured and old and young, and these kinds of really basic functions that any non-colonized society is able to provide for itself. Right. So yeah, I think that's very much what's going on here. It's a something that I would draw a parallel to is the constant references to Hamas as Iran-backed or Iran allied. I wrote not too long ago about the use of the word proxy in news media, and I suggest that when some political organization is described as a proxy, that's meant to delegitimize them, right? Like it's suggesting they're kind of doing the bidding of some outside power. And it also delegitimizes the outside power as like meddling in someone else's affairs. And so the same kind of process is at work when Hamas is constantly, as it has been throughout the recent coverage, described as either an Iranian proxy or at least Iran-backed or an Iranian ally. That works because, of course, Iran has been demonized since the 1979 revolution. And it's a way of just turning Palestinian resistance into an arm of, Iranian malevolence, right? Because there's already this notion that's been planted and nourished for decades in people's minds that Iran is, up to no good, whatever that means. Like typically it's called supporting terrorism, or having some sort of dangerous nuclear program, or any number of other things along those lines. So yeah, linking Hamas, which really is in the public consciousness often presented as being kind of shorthand for all of Palestinians, that really makes Israeli violence look, it can make it, I should say, seem more legitimate, more justified.
Yeah.
Now they're fighting Iran, an actual state, right? Which is a regional power of sorts, not to the, they're not a nuclear armed power like the Israel, and they've been decimated by sanctions and all that, but it's a little bit more of an international conflict between two comparable parties, just in terms of the amount of power that they theoretically have, as opposed to between colonizer and colonized. So it really just is a way of muddying what's going on, right? Which is what's happening. So with so much of this coverage, the goal isn't necessarily always to, out and out convince people to see Israel as, pure and morally righteous, and Palestinians as the opposite. Certainly that is something we see at times in the coverage, but it can be just as effective for the propagandists to just confuse people, right? And to just make people throw up their hands and say, I don't know, these are, it seems these people have been involved in a religious or cultural clash for thousands of years, or, whatever.
That's the main strategy in Britain,
That's
I
right.
think.
Yeah.
Okay. I've seen it a little bit in some of the more right-wing British coverage, but I haven't followed it as closely. It certainly comes up here, but I recall it too in some Guardian coverage of the knives intifada a few years ago. There was a couple that I addressed in my book that really went for, this is a religious conflict.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of thing just makes it seem totally timeless, right? Outside of history, intractable, nothing that can be solved, with no clear good and bad, with no party more in the right or wrong than the other. It's whether it's that, or whether just talking about clashes and exchanges of fire, these things that sort of flatten out the differences and wash over all the details,
Right.
enable people to really make it more likely that people will just not be able to make sense of what's happening, which can be just as damaging, because it's demobilizing, right? Can be just as damaging as being out and out like hardcore Zionist is. If people don't know who's in the right or who's in the wrong, then they're not going to be inclined to want to do anything about it, right? So yeah, I think that's a really important element of it too. Just total obfuscation of what's happening and what has happened prior to the last 10 days or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes across to academia too, that whole thing of, it's complicated. Did you both see this? Some moron with a PhD on Twitter a few days ago.
Oh, the Middle East expert, the scholar with a PhD.
Yeah, he was like,
said he
I've
doesn't
written
want
a
to
book
talk about it
on the Middle East,
Right.
and I'm choosing not to tweet this week. Maybe
Yeah.
you should too. And
Right.
it's just
Right.
like, no.
Right.
I'm happy to report that he got widely mocked, though.
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's also part of the thing, is like, people are led to believe that if they're not a scholar of the Middle East, if they don't understand, the history of the last, 4,000 years in the Middle East, if they don't read every scholarly academic book on the history of the Palestinians, then they're not supposed to have an opinion. And that's a way that Zionists have for forever and ever been able to to kind of push down any sort of conversation, or kind of distract from talking about the real issue, is to say, oh, it's way too complicated, or if they're Israeli or Zionist, they'd say, well, you've never lived there, you don't know what it's like, so you can't have an opinion on Palestinian human rights.
Yeah, and the new one is identity politics
That's
based,
right.
where they say, this offends me, or you're trampling on my agency, or like all this kind of nonsense.
Listen to Israeli voices, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Listen to colonizers,
right? Exactly.
Totally. I was just going to add, and that overlaps with the whole effort to, which seems to have had a bit of a resurgence, to kind of make, Israel the indigenous peoples of Palestine.
Right.
That if you can try to sell that point, it's a little easier to do the sort of academic identity politics about Israeli voices, or, somebody's being offended as a Zionist or something, as though that were
as though Zionism was an identity and not a political ideology.
Not a political movement. That's a colonial movement. So I'm all for their feelings being hurt.
I wanted to bring in kind of how both the US and the UK governments are being portrayed as well by the corporate media. You know, the U.S., of course, being Israel's main financier and aider and abetter of Israel's crimes. Your colleague and our friend Adam Johnson of Citations Needed and also of FAIR tweeted yesterday. I love it. He says, "I'm absolutely losing my mind. Biden blocks a UN ceasefire resolution 4 times and lets Israel's leveling of Gaza run its course for 11 days without any public condemnation or sanction of any kind. And it's spun as an unprecedented tough line. Bizarro world," right? So like Biden considering a $735 million weapons package for Boeing weapons made in Chicago to go and kill Palestinians in Gaza. His blocking 4 times now of UN Security Council ceasefire resolutions. Somehow Biden's MO is being spun as, really giving Netanyahu a hard time right now, and really, kind of this tough guy sort of thing, where it's completely just there's no evidence for this. How is that? Also I think about how Obama, resupplied Israel in 2014 while it was bombing the hell out of Gaza. And again, it was spun as like, oh, Obama's really tough on Israel, and Netanyahu and Obama have all these tensions between them. What is that meant to portray? What's the plan there?
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect to think about. Another weird dimension of it too is saying, I've seen a few times, and Jennifer Rubin in the Post did this a few times, and she wasn't the only one, but yeah, or at least a couple of times, where it's like, geez, Biden, he's really, boy, it's too bad he got sucked into this situation, right. Derailing all of his domestic agenda, or trying to rework the deal with Iran. As though he has no agency in the situation, no capacity to say, oh, I know, I'll just basically tell Israel not to do it, and they won't. And it would have never happened in the first place if he had done that. If he threatened to cut off even...
If he just cut the aid, I mean, it would be one stroke of a pen.
Of course, exactly. Yeah. Even for, he probably could get them to do what he wanted if he threatened to cut off a small portion of the aid. Let alone that, of course, he can and should get rid of it entirely. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this is really crucial, not only to, Israel, Palestine, but also U.S. imperialism generally, to constantly position the U.S. as either, an innocent observer or, working for good, right? Like, saying, go Biden, he's really worried about, Rashida Tlaib's family or something. So he wants to, bring this under control as quickly as possible, as though the U.S. is opposed to war, right? As though the U.S. ruling class has any objection now or at any point in the past to Israel using lethal violence to pursue its aims, which generally are also U.S. aims. So this process that you described is a matter of obscuring the American responsibility for what's happening, so that the American, which is crucial to keeping the whole operation going, right? The American public, if Israel is kind of losing, and they perhaps are to some extent, the hearts and minds of the American population, or at least segments of it, then it's important that they just, direct that anger at Israel in the abstract, and not kind of connect the dots to, oh, wait, there's something that can very easily be done living inside the United States in particular, but also Britain or Canada. So, that's really, as we know, like, where people have leverage is people who at least where we have leverage is where we live, right? Whether that's this or any number of other issues. And so if that's gone and we don't recognize that our governments are playing an absolutely central, a decisive role in in a bloody colonial enterprise, then that really undermines efforts to stop it, and it further legitimizes future U.S. Ventures, right? By kind of burnishing the image of, the U.S. really is working hard to try to bring at least a ceasefire, if not peace, to Palestine. It for Palestine and Israel, it can kind of try to re-burnish this idea that the U.S. is like a neutral, peace
arbiter of peace and democracy.
That'll set us up for like the next nightmare of pretending that that's gonna do anything to resolve the outstanding injustices. So, yeah, I think it's that kind of like laundering the U.S. role is at least as important as putting a gloss on what Israel has done when it comes to audiences inside the United States and also the other powers allied with Israel, like the place where I live. So, I think that that's something that hasn't gotten enough attention and is really important. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Just further to what I was saying earlier about the British media, I mean, it's very similar dynamics to what you're describing. There's the people on the right wing who are more gung-ho and a bit more, exterminate all the brutes, kind of just pure unvarnished racism. But then, and a lot of them are Zionists as well, whether, organized Zionists or just generally part of the ideological construction of empire, really. There are those, but by and large, it is mostly sort of it's complicated, that sort of approach. And I think that is part of the colonial heritage as well, because the whole self-narrative of the British Empire in Palestine up until now, when it's reflected on, is, this is this intractable conflict and we try to do good. Like the empire's narrative always is, really. We try to do good, but the natives insisted on killing each other, sort of thing. All this kind of
we
nonsense.
had no choice, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So it sort of extends from that. But I think, to the extent that I've paid much attention to the mainstream media during this particular onslaught, which isn't very much, to be honest with you, because it's useless.
I only do as an object of study.
Yeah, exactly. Like for the same reason that I spend a lot of my time looking at what the Israel lobby is saying. The British mainstream media, what I've noticed, my impression anyway this time around, is they're just reporting on it less. Like it's whereas before there would be a bit more. I think they kind of know they can't get away with the disinformation so much, whether that's conscious or not. I'm not so sure, but there just seems to be less reporting on it in general than, say, the 2014 war. That's my impression anyway. Like I haven't studied that in any substantive way, but they just sort of seem to be not talking about it to a certain extent, because I think they just know there's more general awareness in the British population about Palestine compared to 2014, and criticism. And also another factor is the Israeli ambassador in London, who is just an outright settler, fanatic, Zippy Hotovelli. So I think they know she's a bit of a liability.
Yes. Do you think that on the other hand, that part of that, if there's been relative dip compared to 2014 in the volume of the coverage. Do you think that there's anything that's connected to like, hey, we already kind of made our point by doing Corbyn in, right? That
Yeah,
it's already been made clear what happens if you get out of line on Palestine. So it kind of doesn't matter what the population knows or thinks, because within the power structure, he's been made an example of, he and obviously his entire movement.
you know what? I think that's probably a more credible explanation than what I was saying a minute ago, which is probably the more optimistic way to look at it. But I think both things play a role. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's true. That's absolutely true. Yeah, they did Corbyn in, and yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of fear there from mainstream journalists, but it's also just cowardice, really, because like the consequences. I mean, Sky News, for example, British Murdoch channel, has got quite a good correspondent who's in the West Bank at the moment, Mark Stone. So I'm not familiar with. No offense to him, but I'd never heard of him before. Again, I don't pay much attention to mainstream media, but yeah, that people have been circulating clips of his reporting from Jerusalem. And it's good. Like he's just saying what he's seeing, and he's sort of challenging the Israeli narrative when it contradicts what he's seeing. So he's doing his job. So of course he's getting viciously slandered by pro-Israel activists online. But it's par for the course.
Greg, finally, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you if you could kind of give some words of advice to people who still, watch mainstream media, still read the New York Times. I know that our parents' generation are still, kind of glued to the MSNBC and, got to go watch Rachel now. Good, well-meaning people, but just channeled, through this lens of mainstream corporate Israel bias. What advice do you have for them about how to be skeptical, and what words or phrases to maybe look out for and dig more into?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would honestly just urge someone to do is that, I mean, I don't want to say pay zero attention to it, because you can find lots of useful information by reading neutral reports, less so-called neutral reports, much less so reading columnists. But what's necessary is to bring a framework to that. And that framework for Palestine, in my view, is the settler colonial framework and the imperialism framework. And so that is the starting point that I would recommend, is that, recognize that there are longer term trajectories, right? And that coexists also with the fact that Palestine is not just is not an island, right? Like, it's obviously enmeshed in not only Middle Eastern but global politics. Yeah. And so it's important to understand those two things as the jumping off point: colonialism and imperialism. I think that can enable people to sort of begin to piece together some of the information that is helpful that you can sift through. I would look for information that comes from more credible institutions that are quoted than just like ambassadors, politicians, and so forth.
Israeli sources.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, part of the problem is sourcing, that you almost never see, PCHR or Al-Mazan or Al-Haq or any of the Palestinian human rights groups quoted, despite the enormous international prestige that a lot of these groups have. But even like just UN sources are going to be a more useful part of what you get in those articles that you might watch, or if they happen to have someone from UNRWA or some other UN agency on TV. Doctors Without Borders, a World Food Program. If you ever see comments from these types of groups, that's or B'Tselem, or even Amnesty International. This can sift through the articles for institutions that are imperfect in a lot of cases, but at least get us a lot closer to having some level of detail that isn't just he said, she said approach, which is kind of what the both sidesism is all about. Now, that's part of what I would say then if you're approaching consuming mainstream news media. But I think beyond that, it's just good to to not read mainstream news media and watch it, or to supplement it at bare minimum. I would urge people to read independent media. Not all of it's good, but Electronic Intifada and Mondoweiss and others in the English-speaking world, but those would be the two at the forefront that come to mind anyway. They are, you're going to get, actual professional journalists like yourselves working there, people who talk to sources, who quote credible sources, who research their work and refer to reliable institutions of the sorts that I was mentioning moments ago, which include on the ground Palestinian sources that cannot just be easily dismissed, despite Zionist and US efforts to dismiss them as just too biased to be believed or whatever. Right. So, I think that people should really try to get past the idea that independent media is, amateurish and just pure ideology, and recognize that, professional mainstream journalism is also ideological. Professional independent journalism, it no doubt has a viewpoint, but that viewpoint is grounded in actual evidence, and you can see it, right? So
we triple fact check.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, exactly. Yeah, when I first, and I know that going through your rigorous editing process, right? Yeah. Some places, actually independent or more mainstream media that I've written for, are not very rigorous about it, and it's a great safety net as a writer to have that. So yes, I can attest that certainly you do have a thorough fact-checking process, which is fantastic. So I mean, it's hard. I remember being, an undergrad and not kind of being where I'm at now politically, and thinking ooh, I don't know, they don't have the prestige of the New York Times or whatever, so I should stick to the credible ones that the guy in the suit on the subway reads or whatever. That really, I think, it is not going to take people very far, and that you can get every bit the same degree of seriousness and honesty that you can get, that you see in the best of professional journalism, which is rare, you see in independent media. So I mean, I really just think, take your time to read through it, look at the sources being quoted, follow the links, and if you determine that the independent media source you're looking at is credible, then it's much more worthwhile when it comes to Palestine, and not only Palestine, to pursue those who are doing the work without being kind of lavished with money from corporations that stand to gain from bloodshed, colonialism, and imperialism, from news media outlets that don't have ties to the government they're ostensibly criticizing. So, I think that there's a lot of value to that. It doesn't mean that everything in independent media is good or flawless, and that everything in mainstream media is crap. But, I'd say to those parents and people of our age group who are reading mainstream media only, at minimum, supplement that and broaden your horizons. And if it's an issue you're interested in, try to read some longer form stuff, even a chapter of the book or a whole one if you get a chance.
Yeah.
Because journalism can only go so far as providing context in terms of the longer arc of history. And on Palestine and really a lot of issues, that's crucially important to understanding what's happening right now.
Yeah. We're going to leave it right there. Greg Shupak, you teach media studies at the University of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in Toronto. Your book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media, is out now. And we're going to link to your most recent article on FAIR. Israel-Palestine coverage presents false equivalency between occupied and occupier. Greg, thank you so much for all of your work and for being with us on the Electronic Intifada.
Thank you.
Thanks, I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.